The Young and the Restless Spoilers. In the quiet corners of Genoa City, the story no one dared to tell was beginning to take shape, hidden behind the mirrored walls of affluence and the silences that followed every scandal. Matt Clark, long thought to have vanished into the background of corporate rebranding under the name Mitch Bacall, had returned to his familiar shadows, watching, calculating, and preparing. His life had always been about reinvention, about mastering the art of being someone else, and now, that ability was turning against everyone who had ever believed they could betray him. To the outside world, he was the polished husband of Sienna Bacall, the charming architect of her new luxury brand, but beneath that immaculate image was a man quietly burning with humiliation. The whispers had reached him before the truth was confirmed. Sienna had been seen too often with Noah Newman, and the warmth in her eyes whenever she spoke of him had the kind of softness that Matt recognized as fatal. For him, love had always been a transaction built on control, and when that control slipped away, the only thing that remained was vengeance. The night of Noah's crash was meant to be ordinary, but the line between coincidence and conspiracy blurred with terrifying precision. The slick road near the canyon, the malfunctioning brake line, the split-second moment where gravity decided the fate of a man, it all formed a cruel choreography too perfect to be random. Rumors swirled through the Newman estate like wildfire, each one darker than the last, while Sienna's trembling hands and sleepless eyes betrayed that she suspected the truth long before Nick started asking questions. Nick had learned over years of corporate warfare and family betrayal that nothing in Genoa City happened by chance. He had buried too many secrets, seen too many smiling faces conceal rot beneath their perfect veneers, to dismiss the idea that someone had orchestrated Noah's accident. The more he watched Sienna, the more he realized she was not the innocent victim she pretended to be. Noah's phone, retrieved from the wreckage, had only one unsent message, a draft addressed to Sienna, cut off mid-word, as if time itself had decided to interrupt a confession. That message became an obsession for Nick, a key to understanding whether his son's downfall had been born from passion, betrayal, or premeditated revenge. Sienna had claimed she was home the night of the crash, yet the GPS records from her car told a different story. She had been near the canyon at the same hour Noah lost control. When Nick confronted her, the flicker of fear in her expression was small but undeniable, the kind that comes from a truth too heavy to admit. But what haunted Nick even more was the look of someone who feared not exposure, but punishment. Sienna was not afraid of the law, she was afraid of Matt. In her private world, Sienna had built a fortress of luxury to mask the prison of her marriage. To everyone else, Mitch Bacall was a supportive husband, a creative partner who had rescued her brand from collapse. But Sienna knew the man behind the mask, the one whose affection could switch to cruelty in a breath, whose charm could slice as deep as a knife. Her affair with Noah had not started from lust but from loneliness. She had been drawn to his kindness, to the way he looked at her without seeing her as a trophy or a possession. For the first time in years, she felt like herself again, unfiltered and real. But every stolen moment carried its own noose, and when the accident happened, Sienna's illusion of freedom shattered. The guilt became unbearable, not just because Noah was nearly killed, but because deep down she suspected that Mitch had known all along. The way he touched her after the crash, the calm in his voice, the chilling lack of surprise in his eyes, it all told her he had orchestrated everything. His revenge wasn't about killing Noah, it was about destroying Sienna's soul, watching her drown in guilt until she became a shadow of herself. Nick's investigation only fueled the fire. He wasn't just searching for answers, he was trying to save his son's soul before the darkness that haunted Genoa City swallowed him whole. Noah, trapped between trauma and confusion, couldn't remember the final moments before the crash, and the fragments of memory that returned in his nightmares were soaked in paranoia. He saw flashes of headlights behind him, the faint glimmer of another car trailing his, and the sound of metal snapping before everything went black. Whether it was an accident or sabotage no longer mattered, the psychological scars were enough to make him question everyone around him. Nick began to suspect that Sienna's fear was more than guilt, it was warning. He followed the trail through hidden bank transfers, private security footage, and whispered threats exchanged in boardroom corridors. Each clue pointed to one name, Mitch Bacall, the man who had rewritten his own identity to escape the ghosts of his past. Behind the scenes, Mitch thrived on the chaos he had created. For him, revenge was never about direct confrontation, it was about dismantling his enemies piece by piece until they questioned their own sanity. He watched Sienna unravel, her career faltering, her friendships fading, and her beauty dimmed by the weight of secrets she couldn't confess. He knew that fear was more effective than violence, that the slow suffocation of guilt could do what no weapon ever could. But he hadn't accounted for Nick's persistence. When Nick uncovered a falsified insurance claim tied to Mitch's company, everything began to shift. The claim had been filed days before Noah's accident, and it covered a luxury vehicle identical to the one Mitch was known to drive. That discovery sent shockwaves through the Newman network, but exposing Mitch wasn't enough. The real danger lay in what he was willing to do next. As Nick pressed forward, the boundaries between justice and obsession began to blur. He wanted to protect his son, but he also wanted to punish those who had endangered him. His anger toward Sienna was matched only by his fascination with her, a dangerous mix that mirrored his father Victor's own moral contradictions. Sienna, desperate and cornered, tried to flee Genoa City, but her attempt was cut short when Mitch's men intercepted her at the private airfield. It was then she realized escape was impossible. Mitch had anticipated her every move. The game had never been about whether she would leave, it was about how long it would take before she begged to stay. Meanwhile, Noah's recovery turned into a haunting reflection of his father's relentless nature. He began to remember the argument with Sienna before the crash, the words she had tried to say but never finished. The fragments pieced together like shards of glass, Sienna confessing that Mitch wasn't who he claimed to be, that his real name was Matt Clark, a man whose history with the Newmans was soaked in manipulation and deceit. When that revelation reached Nick, the entire narrative of the crash shifted. It was no longer just an affair gone wrong, it was a vendetta decades in the making. Matt Clark had once sworn vengeance against the Newman family, and now he had found a way to do it from within, through Sienna, through Noah, through the very emotions that made them human. The storm that followed was not one of gunfire or physical confrontation but of psychological warfare. Mitch began leaking private emails, edited recordings, and intimate photos that painted Sienna and Noah's relationship as scandalous and destructive. The media turned their story into a spectacle, and the public humiliation drove Noah into isolation. Sienna, stripped of credibility, watched as her empire crumbled. The final act of Mitch's revenge was not to destroy their bodies but to ruin their names, to make them pariahs in a city that once adored them. Yet even in his triumph, something inside Mitch began to corrode. The more he tried to control the narrative, the more he became a prisoner of his own obsession. The face he wore in the mirror was no longer his own, it was the reflection of every lie he had ever told. Nick, determined to end the cycle, staged a confrontation at the Bacall estate. He didn't come with the police or the press, he came with the truth. He had found proof that the car part responsible for Noah's accident had been tampered with at a private garage owned by one of Mitch's shell companies. The evidence was irrefutable. But when Nick arrived, he found the mansion empty except for a single envelope addressed to him. Inside was a photo of Noah and Sienna, taken from afar, with a note scrawled in red ink, "She was never yours to protect." That message wasn't just meant to taunt, it was a declaration of victory, the final stroke of a man who lived to manipulate perception. And yet, Genoa City had a way of reclaiming its ghosts. Mitch's empire began to collapse under the weight of exposure. His investors pulled out, his assets were frozen, and whispers of an arrest warrant circulated. But he was gone before the law could catch up, a shadow that disappeared as quietly as he had arrived. Sienna, broken and haunted, tried to rebuild what little was left of her life, but every time she looked in the mirror, she saw Noah's face reflected behind her, the man she had loved and destroyed in equal measure. Nick, meanwhile, was left with the unbearable truth that vengeance in Genoa City never truly ends, it only changes hands. Somewhere beyond the city limits, a man who once called himself Mitch Bacall watched the sunset through tinted glass, the edges of his smile cutting like a blade. For him, the game was never about love or betrayal, it was about power, about proving that he could control the story even when he wasn't in it. And as night fell over Genoa City, one question lingered in the air like smoke. Was the canyon crash the end of Mitch's plan, or merely the beginning of something far more sinister waiting to unfold? In the dimly lit mansion on the outskirts of Genoa City, the air was thick with the kind of silence that spoke louder than any argument could. Sienna had once believed she could keep her life compartmentalized, love and duty in one box, passion and guilt in another, but the boundaries were beginning to blur, and the illusion she had built around herself was collapsing. Mitch Bacall had become increasingly unpredictable, his calm surface masking a storm that was slowly consuming them both. Their marriage had turned into a negotiation of appearances. Every public smile, every gentle touch at a charity gala, was a performance crafted to hide the rot beneath. In private, their exchanges were colder, sharper, their words reduced to veiled threats wrapped in civility. Sienna had once excused his manipulative tendencies as intensity, his obsession with control as a form of devotion, but lately, she had begun to see what everyone else refused to, that Mitch's love had always been conditional, built on the thrill of ownership, not affection. When Noah Newman entered her life, he became the spark that ignited every hidden fault line. He was young, idealistic, reckless enough to think that desire could exist without consequence. For Sienna, he represented a forgotten version of herself, before the lies, before the masks, but she never intended to fall. It began with casual encounters, professional excuses, and long hours spent discussing creative collaborations that had little to do with work. Yet, each meeting blurred further into something dangerous, something real. The night of the canyon crash became the line she could never uncross. Noah's accident was supposed to be a tragic coincidence, but in Genoa City, coincidences were rarer than confessions. Sienna had been with him only hours before, their argument echoing in her head like a curse. He had wanted her to tell the truth, to leave Mitch, to stop living in fear of a man who had long since stopped loving her. But Sienna knew better than to underestimate Mitch's reach. Her husband had eyes everywhere, and his silence was his most terrifying weapon. When news of the crash reached her, she froze, not in grief, but in realization. The pieces fit too perfectly. Mitch had always warned her that secrets have consequences, and now the consequence lay in a hospital bed fighting for his life. Her instinct was to deny everything, to protect herself from suspicion and retribution. When Nick Newman arrived, demanding answers, Sienna's composure was brittle but practiced. She insisted there was nothing between her and Noah, that she hadn't seen him that night, but each denial tasted like ash. The more she downplayed it, the more her fear gave her away. She wasn't afraid of Nick's judgment, she was terrified of Mitch's reaction. Behind closed doors, Mitch watched her unravel with the kind of fascination only a sadist could possess. He knew about Noah, he had known for weeks, and the discovery hadn't broken him, it had invigorated him. For a man like Mitch, betrayal was not a wound but an opportunity. It gave him a target, a reason to reassert control, to remind Sienna who truly owned her fate. His charm became colder, his smiles sharper. He began making subtle remarks about loyalty, about how fragile happiness could be when built on deception. He left her cryptic notes, messages that meant nothing to others but froze Sienna's blood. Once, she found a photo of the canyon road placed neatly on her dresser, the corners smudged with fingerprints that weren't hers. Another time, he mentioned Noah's name casually at dinner, his tone disarmingly calm, as if discussing the weather. Each gesture was designed to keep her guessing, to blur the line between paranoia and reality until she no longer trusted her own mind. Mitch had always been a master of psychological warfare. Before he was Mitch Bacall, he was Matt Clark, a man whose life had been built on deception and revenge. He had reinvented himself so many times that truth and performance were indistinguishable. Sienna had fallen in love with the mask, not the man, and now she was paying the price for not recognizing what lay beneath. When she began sensing that he knew about her affair, it wasn't only her marriage she feared losing, it was her life. Mitch didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. His silence was the punishment, his restraint the threat. He would brush past her in the hallway, his touch lingering just long enough to remind her that he still controlled the narrative. In public, he was the picture of devotion, praising her business achievements and complimenting her designs. In private, he left her to drown in uncertainty. Every headline about Noiah's recovery, every whispered rumor in Genoa City's elite circles, was a carefully calculated torment. He wanted her to suffer not through violence, but through fear, to know that he could destroy everything she loved without ever lifting a hand. Nick, meanwhile, sensed that something larger was unfolding. His instincts as both a father and a Newman told him that the crash was no accident. Noiah's injuries were severe, but the evidence surrounding the wreck was stranger still. There were no skid marks, no signs of mechanical failure that couldn't have been tampered with. The mechanic's report hinted at deliberate interference, brake lines cut with surgical precision. It was a signature Nick recognized from another era, a method too specific to be random. When he began tracing connections, the name Matt Clark surfaced like a ghost from the family's darkest history. He realized too late that Mitch Bacall was more than a name change, it was a resurrection. The same man who once swore to destroy the Newmans had been living among them, disguised as a respectable husband. And now, through Sienna, he had found the perfect path to vengeance. Sienna's life became a performance of control. She moved through her days with mechanical grace, pretending not to hear the echo of Mitch's taunts or the cruel amusement in his eyes. He didn't have to accuse her directly, his mere presence was accusation enough. Sometimes, when she caught his reflection in the mirror behind her, she saw not her husband but a stranger, a man who delighted in her unraveling. Sleep became impossible, every creak of the house felt like a threat, every text message a potential revelation. When she tried to reach out to Nick for help, she hesitated. What could she say? That she believed her husband might have tried to kill his son's lover as punishment for her betrayal? It sounded insane, yet every instinct screamed that it was true. And still, she couldn't leave. Mitch had made sure of that. He controlled her finances, her contracts, her reputation. If she vanished, he would expose everything, and her empire would crumble overnight. So she stayed, trapped in a gilded cage, waiting for the next blow. Mitch, for his part, found a twisted satisfaction in her obedience. He toyed with her emotions the way a cat toys with a dying bird, savoring every flinch, every desperate glance. He began leaving subtle reminders of Noiah's suffering. News clippings, hospital updates, even a recording of the car crash's aftermath leaked online. The cruelty wasn't random, it was ritual. Each act of torment was meant to reinforce a single message: she had no control left. Yet behind his precision was something even darker, a ghost of Matt Clark's old vendetta against the Newmans. Destroying Noiah wasn't only about punishing Sienna, it was about finishing the war he had started years ago. Noiah was merely a proxy, an easy target to hurt both Nick and Sharon, to remind them that Matt Clark's shadow had never truly faded. Sienna's composure finally began to fracture. She started seeing Noiah's face everywhere, in dreams, in reflections, in the flicker of passing headlights. The guilt gnawed at her until she could no longer distinguish between fear and madness. She imagined confronting Mitch, telling him she knew, but every time she tried, her courage dissolved under his gaze. He never raised a hand, yet his control was absolute. When he casually mentioned that the police had reopened the case to investigate possible sabotage, she knew it was his way of warning her, one word out of place, and she would join Noiah in ruin. Her brand began to suffer, her staff whispered, investors grew cautious. Mitch had engineered every downfall with meticulous care. He was erasing her from the inside out. Nick's investigation brought him closer to the truth, but with each step, the danger grew. He discovered surveillance footage placing Mitch near the canyon hours before the crash, yet by the time he presented it to the authorities, the footage had mysteriously vanished. Someone was always one step ahead, erasing trails before he could follow them. Still, he refused to give up. He knew his son's life had been collateral damage in a much bigger game. The more he learned about Mitch's past as Matt Clark, the more he realized how personal this was. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about legacy. Matt wanted to rewrite history by destroying the Newman name one generation at a time. By the time Sienna finally admitted the truth to herself, that she had become both pawn and accomplice, it was too late. Mitch's manipulation had reached its crescendo. He began isolating her completely, cutting her off from friends, monitoring her movements, and ensuring that every attempt to seek help ended in failure. Yet there was one thing he couldn't control, her conscience. The guilt that had once paralyzed her was now transforming into defiance. She began keeping her own records, documenting his threats, compiling evidence of his deceit. For the first time, Sienna wasn't just surviving, she was planning. She didn't know if she wanted justice, freedom, or revenge, only that she wanted an end.